When you picture the Middle Ages, you probably imagine kings in castles, knights in armor, or peasants in muddy fields. But behind every one of them stood an often forgotten figure, someone who stitched together not just clothes, but society itself, the medieval tailor. From royal robes that projected power to the humble tunics of townsfolk, tailors shaped how people looked, lived, and were judged by others. In this video, we'll step inside their workshops, explore their hidden role in trade, religion, and culture, and uncover why tailors were so important in every medieval town. Stay with me, you'll never look at a needle and thread the same way again. Chapter 1. Stitching the Fabric of Survival. When you picture a medieval town, your mind may go first to the blacksmith, pounding iron at his forge, or perhaps the miller, grinding the town's grain into flour. But if you were to ask any ordinary townsman or peasant which trade touched their life the most intimately, the answer might well surprise you. It was the tailor. The medieval tailor was not a fashion designer in the modern sense, nor even a mere mender of torn garments. He was the quiet craftsman whose work made daily survival possible. Clothing was more than a matter of modesty in the Middle Ages. It was warmth against bitter winters, protection from rain and mud, and a visible marker of social class in a rigidly stratified society. For every man, woman, and child, from the lord of the manor to the poorest plowman, the services of the tailor were essential. You can imagine a small workshop tucked into a corner of a bustling medieval town. The air would be filled with the earthy scent of wool and the faint sharpness of newly scraped leather. Rolls of coarse homespun cloth might be stacked against one wall, while finer bolts of imported linen, or even silk rare and precious, might be kept under lock and key. A simple wooden table would be covered in shears, needles, spindles of thread, and scraps of half-finished garments. Here, the tailor worked long hours, often by the dim light of a tallow candle, his craft shaping not only the clothes, but the very rhythm of daily life. To understand why tailors were indispensable, you need to consider the realities of clothing production in medieval Europe. Unlike today, where garments are cheaply manufactured and easily replaced, clothing in the Middle Ages was a precious commodity. Most people owned only a handful of garments, perhaps a heavy woolen tunic, a lighter shirt of linen, and one pair of hose. These had to last for years, sometimes even decades, passed down from parent to child, patched and repaired again and again. The tailor's skill ensured that these few garments could endure, adapting them for new wearers or reshaping them as fashions shifted ever so slowly. The materials themselves dictated much of the tailor's work. Wool was by far the most common fabric in Europe. Sheep were raised not only for meat but for their fleece, and every village had access to raw wool. Yet turning fleece into wearable cloth was a laborious process. Shearing, cleaning, carding, spinning, weaving, and finally fulling the cloth to thicken it. Linen, made from flax, was prized for undergarments and summer clothing, though it required intensive cultivation and processing. Tailors needed to understand the qualities of each fabric, how to cut it, how it draped, how to stitch it so it would not unravel. Tools were simple but effective. Large iron shears cut through thick woolen cloth. Needles, often made of bone or bronze before steel became common, were threaded with coarse yarn or finer linen thread. Thimbles of leather or brass protected the fingers during hours of stitching. Measuring was done by eye or with knotted cords, since standardized rulers were rare. The skill lay not in elaborate technology, but in the patient hand of the craftsman, who could shape cloth to fit the human form beyond the practical. Clothing served as one of the most visible markers of medieval society's rigid hierarchies. Sumptuary laws, enforced by many towns and kingdoms, dictated what colors, fabrics, and trimmings different classes could wear. A tailor had to be acutely aware of these regulations. A wealthy merchant might order a gown lined with fur or decorated with embroidery, but a peasant's tunic had to remain plain. Violating these laws could bring heavy fines. Thus, the tailor's role was not only technical but also social. He helped enforce the visual boundaries of medieval life. The tailor's shop was also a place of community. Villagers would gather to discuss repairs, barter payments in eggs or grain, and share gossip. Tailors often accepted non-monetary payments since coinage was scarce. A farmer might trade a sack of barley for a new pair of hose. A shepherd might offer raw fleece in exchange for a patched cloak. This web of barter tied the tailor intimately to the economic survival of the town. The work, however, was not without its struggles. Tailors were often subject to the regulations of guilds, powerful organizations that controlled trade in medieval towns. Guild membership provided protection, standardizing wages and quality, but it also imposed strict rules. Apprenticeship lasted years, during which young boys worked long hours under a master tailor, learning every stage of the craft from cutting to stitching. Only after producing a masterpiece garment could one hope to become a full-fledged master and open an independent shop. Many tailors spent their entire lives as journeymen, moving from town to town, never quite achieving the security of mastery. But despite these hardships, the tailor remained central to daily life. Every cloak stitched, every tunic patched, and every hood lined against the cold represented the quiet triumph of human ingenuity over the harshness of medieval existence. Clothing was survival, and the tailor was its guardian. As you sit here imagining the dim flicker of candlelight across a tailor's bench, the steady rhythm of needle through cloth, and the muffled hum of voices outside in the market square, one question lingers. Beyond their practical work, what role did medieval tailors play in shaping culture, identity, and even politics in their towns? Chapter 2: Fashion, Identity, and the Tailor's Influence. When you think about medieval life, you may picture a world of sameness. Men in brown tunics, women in simple woolen dresses, and little distinction between one villager and the next. Yet this image overlooks the subtle but important role of clothing in defining personal identity, community belonging, and even politics. At the center of these distinctions stood the tailor, the quiet craftsman whose hands shaped how people looked, how they were judged, and how they fit into the broader order of society. Clothing in the Middle Ages carried meanings that went far beyond simple utility. For peasants, the tunic and cloak were practical protections against the cold, but even their cut and stitching hinted at regional differences or personal circumstances. In Northern Europe, heavier cloaks and tighter hose helped withstand biting winters, while in Southern Europe, lighter fabrics were chosen for comfort. The tailor knew these local needs intimately, adjusting patterns to match the seasons and the geography. But beyond geography, clothing served as a visible declaration of social place. And here the tailor's work touched the heart of medieval identity. Consider the importance of color. Dyes in the Middle Ages were costly, derived from plants, minerals, and insects. A deep, rich blue required woad or indigo. Bright scarlet came from imported cochineal or kermes. Green might be layered from blue and yellow dyes. Most peasants could only afford the dull browns and grays produced from undyed wool or simple vegetable dyes. A tailor, however, had to know which fabrics could accept certain dyes, which colors would fade, and how to combine threads to stretch expensive hues further. When a wealthier customer ordered a gown of bright crimson, the tailor's knowledge was not only technical but symbolic. A red cloak might suggest prosperity, authority, or even vanity. Its display in the town square was as much a political statement as a personal one. Then there were the sumptuary laws, strict regulations enforced by kings, bishops, and town councils. These laws forbade ordinary townsfolk from wearing certain fabrics such as silk, velvet, or ermine, which were reserved for the nobility. Tailors had to navigate these laws carefully. A merchant might demand sleeves cut in the style of the nobility, but too close an imitation could risk fines or punishment. In this sense, the tailor was both craftsman and gatekeeper, shaping clothes that allowed people to express ambition while avoiding social overstep. The tailoring guilds, too, added layers of influence. In towns such as London, Paris, or Florence, The tailoring guild regulated who could sew what garments, what wages could be charged, and which fabrics could be handled. Some guilds held near monopolies over particular trades. Only guild members could make cloaks, while another group might specialize in hose. For the customer, this meant that clothing was not just a matter of individual choice, but part of a carefully controlled system, where tailors themselves became the enforcers of civic order. Yet within these rules, tailors shaped trends. By the late Middle Ages, for example, men's fashions began shifting dramatically. Hose became tighter, tunics shorter, and pointed shoes exaggerated in length. These styles originated among the elite, but it was the tailor's skill that translated them into wearable forms for townsfolk and even peasants who sought to mimic their betters. The spread of such trends reveals how tailors acted as conduits between classes, transferring styles downward through adaptation and simplification. Without their ingenuity, fashions would have remained locked in palaces and courts, never filtering into the streets and markets of everyday towns. There's also the question of gender and identity. Women's garments in the Middle Ages were often layered in underdress of linen, an overdress of wool, sometimes with a mantle or veil. Tailors had to design these clothes to be functional for work, but also modest in accordance with church teaching. Yet even within these limits, women found ways to express individuality through sleeve shapes, the length of a gown, or the cut of a neckline. Again, the tailor mediated these choices, balancing personal preference with community standards. Think, too, about the symbolic role of clothing in life events. A bride's gown, even if plain, marked one of the most important days in her life. A knight's surcoat, emblazoned with heraldic colors, declared loyalty on the battlefield. A monk's habit, stitched with deliberate simplicity, represented vows of poverty and devotion. Each of these garments passed through the hands of a tailor or a related craftsman. In this way, the tailor's work stitched together not only fabric, but the very rituals of life birth, marriage, work, and death. Clothing also played a role in civic pride. Town processions, feast days, and religious festivals often required coordinated dress. Tailors were called upon to create banners, guild uniforms, or special garments for ceremonial use. These were not everyday clothes, but statements of belonging and community strength. A tailor might spend weeks preparing a set of tabards for a guild's annual procession, each one marked with the same insignia, each stitch a contribution to the town's collective identity. Economically, tailors formed part of a broader chain that connected local producers to international trade. The wool trade of England, for example, sent raw fleece across the Channel to Flanders, where it was spun and woven into fine cloth. Tailors in English towns then cut and shaped that imported cloth into garments for local buyers. In Italy, silk from the East flowed into workshops, where tailors adapted it into gowns for wealthy patrons. Thus, through their daily work, tailors became the final link in a vast network of trade, stretching across Europe and beyond. At the personal level, the tailor often held a kind of quiet authority. Imagine a wealthy merchant ordering a doublet lined with fur. The tailor might suggest adjustments to the cut or the choice of trim, not only because of technical reasons, but because he knew what was fashionable, what was permissible, and what would impress in the market square. The tailor's voice, though soft, shaped how people presented themselves in public. In this way, the tailor was not only a craftsman, but a subtle advisor, blending practical skill with social knowledge. And yet, while their influence was undeniable, tailors lived modestly. Their shops were small, their earnings meager compared to the grandeur of the garments they produced. They worked long hours, often by candlelight, squinting to see stitches in dim light. Their own clothes were plain, for guild rules and economic necessity discouraged extravagance. It is one of history's quieter ironies. The people who clothed the nobility and merchants in splendor lived themselves in simplicity, their legacy hidden in scenes and stitches rather than in monuments or titles. By the later Middle Ages, changes were beginning to stir. The growth of cities, The spread of literacy and the increasing wealth of the middle classes meant that more people could afford more garments, more variety, and more style. Tailors became busier, their skills in higher demand. Yet this also brought tension between guild restrictions and market opportunities, between tradition and innovation. Tailors stood at a crossroads of change, their quiet craft reflecting broader shifts in medieval society. As you picture the tailor bent over his bench, shears glinting in the candlelight, scraps of bright fabric scattered across the floor, one question emerges: how did this quiet trade, so essential to daily life, adapt to the changing tides of economy, politics, and culture as the medieval world gave way to the dawn of the Renaissance? Chapter 3: The Legacy of the Tailor in Medieval Society. If the tailor of the Middle Ages appears at first to be a modest figure, his influence emerges more clearly when you consider the ways in which clothing has shaped history itself. In every hemline, every stitch, and every color choice, the tailor left traces that tell us about class structures, shifting economies, cultural values, and even the beginnings of the modern fashion industry. To close the story of the medieval tailor, we need to look at his role not just as a maker of clothes, but as a shaper of society. Let us start with the most visible impact: clothing as a marker of power. Medieval kings and queens understood well that authority was expressed not only in laws and armies but also in the display of wealth. Royal garments of silk, velvet, and fur projected dominance at feasts and coronations. Yet those same garments had to be cut, stitched, and assembled by skilled hands. Without tailors, the spectacle of monarchy would have been reduced to bolts of cloth lying unused in storerooms. The tailor transformed raw material into political theater, enabling rulers to clothe themselves in authority. This power of visual impression extended downward through the ranks of nobility and into the merchant classes. A successful merchant might commission a gown with imported fabrics not only to display wealth, but to reinforce his position in the hierarchy of town society. Tailors, in this sense, were instrumental in mediating status. They translated wealth into garments that could be seen and judged by others. In towns where social climbing was closely watched, what one wore often determined how one was treated. The tailor's work, therefore, was not just about fabric, but about the fragile negotiations of prestige and acceptance. Tailors also contributed indirectly to the spread of ideas. Fashion trends did not move in isolation, but followed the paths of trade, war, and diplomacy. When knights returned from crusades, they brought with them not only stories and relics, but also new clothing styles, different ways of fastening cloaks, different fabrics like cotton, or new forms of headgear. Tailors studied these novelties, adapted them, and gradually spread them through their local workshops. In this way, they became silent participants in cultural exchange, stitching together influences from far-off regions into the daily fabric of European life. Economically, the tailor's position tied him into one of the most important industries of the medieval world: textiles. Cloth was wealth, as valuable as land or gold. Whole towns, like those in Flanders or northern Italy, thrived on the production and sale of textiles. The tailor was the endpoint of this vast system, where wool shorn from English sheep, dyed with Italian madder, and woven in Flemish looms became a finished garment. Each cut of the shears marked the final stage of a journey that stretched across fields, markets, and ports. Tailors, though local in practice, were deeply embedded in the global economy before the term even existed. Their work also reveals much about the regulation of labor and trade in the Middle Ages. The tailoring guilds, as discussed earlier, set prices, controlled apprenticeships, and standardized quality. These guilds were not only professional organizations, but also part of the civic order, contributing to town defenses, sponsoring altars in local churches, and participating in parades. Tailors thus had a dual identity. They were humble craftsmen in their shops, yet collectively, they were respected members of civic life, part of the rhythm that held medieval towns together. Another enduring aspect of the tailor's role was the personal relationship with clients. Unlike mass-produced clothing today, medieval garments were almost always custom-made. A tailor measured each body, cut fabric accordingly, and adjusted garments for fit. This personal process created a connection between craftsman and customer that was both intimate and practical. Tailors knew their clients' sizes, their preferences, and sometimes their secrets. A noble might confide ambitions through the choice of a lavish cloak. A widow might request a sober gown that reflected both grief and modesty. In the tailor's shop, clothing was a quiet language, and the tailor was its interpreter. The tailor's influence also extended to moments of change and upheaval. Consider the Black Death of the 14th century. With so many lives lost, social structures shifted. Survivors, particularly peasants and laborers, often found themselves with slightly higher wages or opportunities to improve their social standing. One way they expressed this newfound position was through clothing. Tailors were suddenly making garments for people who, a generation earlier, could not have afforded them. This subtle democratization of fashion marked a shift in how society worked, and the tailor was there to record it. Needle and thread in hand, even religion did not escape the tailor's reach. Monastic orders relied on simple but uniform garments to symbolize devotion and humility. Tailors provided these habits, ensuring that monks and nuns presented themselves in ways consistent with their vows. Meanwhile, clergy needed vestments for mass ornate, embroidered garments whose symbolism was steeped in theology. Here the tailor's role intersected with spiritual life, crafting garments that were not only functional but sacred. As the Middle Ages drew to a close and Europe edged toward the Renaissance, the tailor's world began to change. New fabrics arrived from global trade routes, cotton from the Middle East, silk from China, and eventually, dyes from the Americas. Fashion grew increasingly complex, with slashed sleeves, padded doublets, and intricate embroidery. Tailors had to learn new techniques, adopt new tools, and adjust to a world where clothing became an even sharper marker of wealth and innovation. What had once been a craft rooted in simplicity was becoming the foundation of a fashion system that would flourish in later centuries. Yet, for all this, the everyday tailor remained a quiet figure in the background of history. His name rarely survives in chronicles. His shop seldom appears in town records beyond guild rolls or tax lists. His legacy lies not in monuments, but in the very fabric of medieval life. The garments that ordinary people wore to market, to mass, to festivals, and to funerals all passed through his hands. He clothed people in the rhythms of life itself. When you think about the Middle Ages, you might focus on castles, battles, or kings. But look closer at the seams, and you will see another story. One of countless tailors, scissors in hand, shaping society stitch by stitch. Their work reminds us that history is not only about the grand and the glorious, but also about the small and the steady, the quiet crafts that hold life together. And so the lingering question remains, if tailors were so central to medieval life, why do we remember so few of them by name? And how much of their silent influence has been hidden beneath the centuries of fabric they once so carefully cut and stitched? And that brings us to the quiet end of today's story. I hope this calm journey through medieval life helped you unwind and drift a little closer to rest. If you enjoyed this slow and sleepy history, I'd be so grateful if you could gently tap the like button and subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep. It helps me keep bringing you these peaceful stories night after night. Until next time, rest well, and may your sleep be as calm as the quiet villages we visited together.